Giselle Fontaine called it a graveyard for failed ambitions. She said those words in front of 300 people in the most expensive banquet hall in Ashford, and she smiled when she said them. That corner lot on Delwood Street had swallowed 2 restaurants, 1 cafe, and her own company's $1 million redevelopment project without leaving a trace. No one dared touch it after that. No one except Caleb Harrington. He arrived with $40,000 in savings, a 6-year-old daughter who still slept every night with a stuffed bear named Biscuit, and a pumpkin soup recipe that had belonged to his late wife. Giselle Fontaine never looked back at that corner. She would spend considerable time regretting that. What happens when the man, a room full of people quietly dismissed, becomes the thing the most powerful woman in the room cannot stop thinking about? The morning it all began, Caleb Harrington was standing at a kitchen counter barely wide enough for one person, frying eggs in a pan with a loose handle he had been meaning to replace for 3 months. The apartment was a second-floor rental in a building that smelled faintly of old carpet and radiator heat. The walls, the kind of off-white that comes not from paint, but from years of ordinary living, pressing in from every direction. The windows were thin enough that he could hear the pigeons landing on the fire escape each morning, like a reluctant alarm. He was 33 years old, unemployed for the 7th consecutive month, and moving through his mornings with the deliberate calm of someone who had already lost the thing that had frightened him most, and was still, somehow, here. He cracked 2 eggs into the pan and watched them settle, and thought about the rent due at the end of the week and the cost of the new burner gasket he needed for the small catering job he had booked for Saturday, and he did all of this without expression, because expression had begun to feel like a luxury he could not particularly afford. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing 1 shoe and carrying Biscuit by the ear. She was 6 years old, with dark eyes and her mother's habit of asking 1 question when she meant a dozen. She climbed onto the counter stool, arranged the bear carefully on the folded dish towel beside the salt shaker, and watched her father work the pan with the attentive silence of a child who has spent many mornings in kitchens. Then she said, "Are you going to look at the new restaurant today, Dad?" He said he was. She turned this over for a moment with the particular seriousness she brought to anything that mattered to her. "Does Mom know?" Caleb set the pan down before he answered. He looked at his daughter, at the bear on the dish towel, at the pale winter light coming through the thin window above the sink. He said yes, he believed she did. Maeve Harrington had died 18 months earlier in a car accident on the east side of Ashford on a Tuesday evening in November, returning from a curriculum workshop she had attended every semester for 4 years. She was 31 years old. She had spent a decade teaching Caleb that cooking was not about impressing people, it was about keeping them. She used to say it in whatever small kitchen they happened to be renting at the time. Always calm, always precise, her hands moving over the cutting board, with the ease of someone who already knew where everything was going before the meal started. He had never forgotten the way she tasted a dish not quickly, but with complete attention, pausing, adjusting, considering what the person eating it would need from it. Before her death, Caleb had been the head chef at Vaulted, a flagship restaurant under Fontaine Dining Group, the kind of establishment that appeared in national food publications and charged $60 for a plate that could have fed a family of 3. He had lasted 4 years there before his departure, which came after a conflict with the operations director over the decision to replace several key ingredients with cheaper commercial alternatives in order to improve quarterly margins. The substitution would have been invisible to most diners. Caleb refused to sign off on it anyway. The operations director told him the choice was not really a choice. Caleb cleaned out his station methodically, shook hands with 2 line cooks he respected, and walked out into a cold February afternoon without a plan and without a single regret, and none of that had changed in the months since. 7 months of teaching online cooking workshops for $22 an hour had kept the lights on. His $40,000 in savings accumulated over a decade of low wages, long hours, and 2 years of careful restraint after Maeve died, sat in. He had read the property listing for 14 Delwood Corner 4 times before he admitted to himself that he was going to go look at it, and he drove there on a Thursday morning without telling anyone, because he already knew what Owen and Charlotte would say, and he wanted to see it first with his own eyes. He went alone. The building was a 90-square-meter commercial shell on the ground floor of a 3-story brick structure. built sometime in the early 1960s, and maintained since, with only the effort required to keep it standing. One of the front windows had a crack sealed with electrical tape. The floor was scuffed concrete under a layer of old linoleum that peeled at the corners. The walls were a shade of beige that might once have been white, and the whole space smelled of moisture and settled dust, and something faintly metallic that Caleb eventually traced to an old drain pipe in the back corridor. Aldrich Webb, the landlord, was 70 years old and wore a canvas jacket and the expression of a man who had explained bad news so many times it no longer required any visible effort. He told Caleb plainly, 2 previous tenants had folded within 4 months each. He would not be able to refund the deposit under any circumstances. The block had a reputation, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. He stepped back and let Caleb walk the room on his own. Caleb moved slowly through the space, touching the walls, checking the subfloor with the heel of his boot, testing the width of the kitchen corridor, mentally placing the range and the cold storage and the prep table and the pass-through. He stopped at the far wall, where a long crack in the plaster let in a slant of afternoon light that cut across the concrete floor in a pale diagonal. He stood there for several minutes without moving. He thought about Maeve, specifically about something she had told him one winter when they were living in a basement apartment in the city's northeast corner, a place with no natural light, and a landlord who fixed nothing. She had said, "The worst spaces usually have the best light. You just have to know where to look." He looked at the crack and the pale line it threw across the floor, and the fact that the room had good bones underneath everything it had accumulated. He signed the lease for 18 months before he left the building. Owen Garrett called him 40 minutes after the news reached him and said he had genuinely lost his mind. Charlotte Voss came by that evening, reviewed the lease and the projected startup budget with the unhurried precision of someone who did this professionally, shook her head slowly, and then offered to handle his books at no charge for the first 3 months. She offered this as though the alternative had not occurred to her. He named the restaurant Maeve's Corner that same night, sitting at the kitchen table with Lily eating cereal across from him. When he said the name out loud, she clapped with both hands, sustained and certain. Owen, informed by text, sent back a brief response and apparently drank a beer alone in his apartment. The concept was fully formed in Caleb's mind before he had signed anything. A neighborhood dining room with a rotating seasonal menu, one daily special written by hand on a chalkboard, plates, priced between $18 and $22. No printed wine list, no fixed courses, no theater. Everything he had come to resent about Fontaine's philosophy, reversed. He would buy from 3 local farms and a fishmonger he had worked with for years. Every stock from scratch. The pumpkin soup on the menu every autumn, made from Maeve's recipe, not modified by so much as a pinch. While clearing the floor during the renovation weeks, 5 months of evenings and weekends, while he continued to teach workshops during the day, Caleb found a sheaf of papers wedged beneath a loose section of the old floorboards near the back wall. He pulled them out, brushed them off, and set them on the plywood work table he was using as a desk. He flipped through the first few pages, recognized the Fontaine Dining Group letterhead, and returned the envelope to the drawer without reading further. He went back to painting. He did not think much about it at the time. He would, with some intensity, later. The Ashford Culinary Excellence Awards were held in mid-October at the Harwick Grand Hotel, in a ballroom with high ceilings and circular tables covered in cream linen. It was the most significant professional gathering in the local food industry each calendar year, attended by restaurateurs, chefs, investors, food writers, and civic officials who enjoyed proximity to culinary prestige. Fontaine Dining Group sponsored 3 of the evening's award categories, and had done so for 5 consecutive years. Giselle Fontaine presented the keynote before the ceremony began. She was 40 years old, dressed in a black wrap dress with small gold earrings, and she carried herself across the stage with the specific, unhurried certainty of someone who had never once been the least powerful person in any room she had entered. She had built Fontaine Dining Group over 12 years, from a single French bistro into a 12-property portfolio extending across the eastern half of the state. She did not eat in her own restaurants. She considered that a mark of discipline. Her speech covered the group's recent expansion, the challenges of staffing in a competitive market, and the importance of rigorous quality standards. Toward the middle, she paused at a reference to the lessons that had cost the most. She mentioned Delwood Corner by name. She said that Fontaine had invested significantly in that location 3 years prior and had chosen to walk away not because the company lacked vision, but because some ground simply could not support what was asked of it. She described it as a location that absorbed investment and returned nothing. Then she said the words that would stay with Caleb long after the evening ended. That block has been a graveyard for failed ambitions. Now it serves as a useful reminder that not every piece of land deserves to be saved. Some places are simply for people who have no better options. The room responded politely. A few people smiled at the line. No one looked toward the back tables. Caleb was seated near the service corridor, invited as a +1 by a former line cook from Vaulted who had moved into catering. He had come because he needed to eat, and the alternative was cooking alone in a half-finished kitchen. He sat in his chair and listened to Giselle's description of the place where he had committed every dollar he owned, and he did not move. He looked down at his hands, the calluses across his palms, from 5 months of pulling floorboards, hanging drywall, caulking windows, hauling salvaged furniture, and seasoning a cast-iron pan collection bought piece by piece from a salvage dealer on the south side. He looked at them for a moment. Then he nodded once, to no one in particular, and left before dessert. Giselle, returning to her car after the event, spoke by phone with Marcus. She asked for an update on the Delwood acquisition, the long-running plan to purchase all remaining leasable units on the block and convert the entire street front into an upscale dining concept under the Fontaine 11 brand. Marcus told her the leasehold on Unit 14 had been signed by a private tenant the previous week on an 18-month contract. Giselle paused. She asked who. Marcus said, Caleb Harrington. She was quiet for 3 seconds. She recognized the name immediately, the head chef she had personally authorized the removal of 2 years prior. The one who had refused the ingredient change on a matter of principle and walked out as though the decision had been easy. She said, He will be gone in 6 months. Her voice was not unkind. It was the particular tone of someone stating what they already know to be true. Maeve's Corner opened on a Saturday morning in the second week of November, with no press announcement and no launch event. Only a chalkboard sign set on the sidewalk, with the day's menu in Caleb's careful block letters, a pot of pumpkin soup simmering on the rear burner from 9 o'clock, and Lily standing behind the host counter with biscuit in her lap and a cardboard sign she had made herself, which she insisted on placing in the front window. The sign read, in her careful 6-year-old printing, Today's Special, Made with Love. Caleb looked at it for a long moment when she held it up, and then he said yes and taped it to the glass himself without changing a single letter. 11 people came the first day, mostly neighborhood residents drawn by the smell and the novelty of something new on a block that had seen only closings for years. Charlotte Voss arrived at noon, ordered the pumpkin soup and a slice of seeded bread, ate without speaking, and when she finished set her spoon down and said, This is something I did not know I was missing. Owen, who had relented and agreed to work 3 lunch shifts per week without pay through the first month, stood at the back of the kitchen and pretended to adjust the ventilation hood. The second week brought an average of 20 covers per day below the threshold required to cover costs, but exactly within Caleb's projected loss tolerance for the opening month. He tracked every expense in a composition notebook with a red cover, written by hand because Charlotte had taught him that manual tracking forced a kind of attention that a spreadsheet did not. He recorded every supplier invoice, every table served, every plate returned unfinished, every compliment passed through the kitchen pass-through, and every repair. Aldrich Webb came in on the 10th day of operation, a Tuesday, at noon. He sat at the window table, ordered the day's special, paid in cash, said nothing to anyone, and left. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that, by the end of the second week, he had eaten there 7 times. Neither of them mentioned it, and it became a kind of quiet understanding between them. The machine that tested Caleb most severely in those early weeks was not the oven or the cooler or the scheduling challenge of running a kitchen with 1.5 cooks. It was the dishwasher, which failed completely on the 23rd day of operation in the middle of Saturday dinner service with every table occupied. The repair cost $420, which came directly from the emergency reserve. To cover the gap it left, he sold the last item of personal value he still owned. A stainless steel watch with a scratched crystal, a wedding gift from Maeve, engraved on the back in her handwriting. He left it at a pawn shop on Monday morning and was back at the range before 11. He told no one. By the second month, Maeve's Corner had developed a small and steady following, working families from the surrounding blocks, retired couples who came on weekday mornings, a handful of professionals who had started eating lunch there regularly. A food blogger with a modest following mentioned the pumpkin soup in a post about neighborhood dining, which brought a second modest wave of visitors. The numbers were not remarkable, but they were consistent. Charlotte had made clear from the beginning. Consistent was the only metric that actually mattered in month 2. It was apparently enough to appear on Fontaine Dining Group's monitoring screens. A man named Marcus arrived on a Thursday afternoon, too formally dressed for the room, ordered a coffee he did not drink, and after 5 minutes laid a written offer on the table to purchase the remaining term of Caleb's lease for $120,000. Caleb listened carefully, thanked him, and declined. Marcus returned the following Monday with a revised offer of $180,000. Caleb thanked him again and declined again. Both exchanges were polite and unambiguous. Giselle called him directly 2 days after the second visit. Her voice was controlled, the particular smoothness of someone who had spent enough time in negotiation to flatten all the rough edges from their delivery. She told him he was working in a location without a future, and that she was offering him a clean exit. Caleb held the phone and watched Lily draw at the prep table in the corner, a dog with enormous ears, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth in concentration. He said, "Thank you, but I don't need an exit." The week after that call, a health and safety inspector arrived unannounced during the Friday lunch rush, at precisely the window of peak volume. The 2-hour closure required while the inspection was conducted cost Caleb the better part of the day's revenue and drew confused looks from a dining room that had been full. The inspector found nothing. Every surface clean, every temperature log complete, every storage container properly labeled. Caleb had run clean kitchens his entire career and kept this one to a standard he would have held a 3-star establishment to. Owen pulled him aside after the closure lifted and said, "That was not a coincidence." Caleb knew that already. Without documentation, a pattern was still not proof. Charlotte's updated forecast that evening was measured and precise. If the interference continued at its current rate, operating cash flow would not survive past 2.5 months. She delivered this information without alarm, her reading glasses on the table and the notebook open between them. Caleb thanked her and sat with it after she left. He thought about the envelope in the drawer. That night, alone in the kitchen after closing, he opened it again and read everything. Among the contract drafts and site plans was a single-page addendum to a lease negotiation between Fontaine Dining Group and Aldrich Webb, dated 3 years prior. The language was dense, but the substance was plain. Fontaine had paid Webb a substantial advance fee, recorded on paper as a consulting retainer, in exchange for a conditional exclusivity clause preventing him from leasing Unit 14 to any competing food or beverage establishment for a period of 3 years. The addendum was unsigned, but bore Giselle's initials in the margin and was printed on Fontaine letterhead. If enforced, it would retroactively invalidate Caleb's lease. If examined by the city's Commercial Conduct Board, it could constitute an illegal restraint of trade. Fontaine had never filed it formally. It remained in draft status, in an envelope, untouched beneath the floorboards for 3 years, which meant it was a weapon they could not use without exposing themselves to the very investigation they were trying to prevent. Caleb folded the document carefully, returned it to the envelope, and placed the envelope back in the drawer. He understood, for the first time since Marcus had walked into the restaurant with a briefcase, precisely where he stood on the board. Diana Ashworth arrived on a Wednesday in the 3rd month without a reservation and without any visible reason to be in the neighborhood. She was a small woman in her early 60s, wearing a brown linen coat and low shoes, with close-cropped silver hair and the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to waiting for the right detail to surface on its own, rather than reaching for it. She sat at the corner table by the window, ordered the pumpkin soup, the seared trout with braised greens, and a glass of house water, and ate without consulting her phone or speaking to anyone. Caleb served her himself, a habit he kept on slow midweek afternoons, working the floor while Owen managed the kitchen. He refilled her water once and did not hover. She was nearly finished with the soup when she looked up and asked how long he had been making it. He said, 11 years, but the recipe wasn't his. She asked whose it was. He told her about Maeve, that she had worked out the balance of cream to stock in the autumn she was 24 and had never adjusted it since, because she said once you found something that worked for people, you did not change it without a reason. The woman at the table listened, looking at her bowl. She did not write anything down. She asked one more question. Was his wife still cooking? He said no. He said she had been gone for a year and a half. Diana Ashworth thanked him for lunch, paid in cash, left a reasonable tip, and walked out. He did not know who she was until 3 weeks later. The review appeared in the Meridian Fork, the oldest and most respected food publication in the region, with a readership that extended well beyond Ashford and the attention of every hospitality professional in the state. Diana Ashworth had given Maeve's Corner 4 lines of brief technical praise and devoted the remainder of a half-page column to something harder to quantify. She wrote that the restaurant did not attempt to impress anyone. She wrote that it fed people in the older sense of the word deliberately, with attention, without performance. Her final sentence read, "Sometimes what you need most is not a meal that shows off, but a room where someone cooked for you as though it mattered." The effect was immediate. Within 72 hours, the reservation book was full for the next 2 weekends. Walk-in traffic increased to the point where Caleb had to start a daily wait list. Giselle Fontaine read the review in her office on a Friday morning, in print, with her coffee going cold. She read it twice. She told Marcus to investigate whether Ashworth had any prior personal or professional connection to Harrington. Marcus reported back. None he could find. That made her more uncomfortable than a connection would have. That night, after the kitchen was closed and Lily had fallen asleep on the small sofa in the corner of the prep room with Biscuit tucked in beside her, Caleb sat alone at the table nearest the window with the printed copy Charlotte had left for him. He read it slowly, all the way through. When he reached the last sentence, he stopped. He sat with it for a long time in the quiet room. Then he put both hands flat on the paper, and he cried quietly, without moving, the way people cry when they are not trying to cry at all. It was the first time since the day of Maeve's funeral. He was not certain what had broken loose. He knew only that the last line sounded like something she would have said, in a basement kitchen with no windows, tasting a pot of soup and nodding and deciding it was ready. 2 weeks after the review, a pop-up restaurant opened directly across the street from Maeve's Corner, in a storefront that had been vacant since the previous spring. It arrived without warning, polished promotional materials, complimentary tastings for the first 7 days. A young chef with a large following and a professional media presence who had not, as far as anyone could verify, previously expressed any interest in the Delwood neighborhood. The pop-up ran a modern small plates format at no cover charge for a week and drew substantial crowds. The same week, an anonymous post appeared on a local food forum raising concerns about the sourcing practices at Maeve's Corner, implying without evidence that Caleb lacked the managerial certifications required to operate a licensed food service establishment, and suggesting that the restaurant's growing reputation was built on misdirection about ingredient quality. The post was written with enough technical-sounding language to seem credible to a reader without specific knowledge, and it circulated quickly. Owen traced it as far as he could, and found a trail cut off at a commercial IP relay enough to suggest, not enough to prove. Regular guests began asking Caleb directly about the sourcing claims. Some brought printouts. He answered each question patiently with documentation, supplier invoices, delivery logs, inspection records, without making anyone feel accused for asking. Several regulars stayed. Others did not return for 2 weeks, then 3. Reservations in the 2 weeks following the post dropped by just under a third. Charlotte updated the forecast without being asked and brought the notebook to the kitchen before service one morning, setting it open on the pass-through without commentary. 2.5 months of operating capital remaining, if conditions held. That evening, Caleb sat by Lily's bed after she fell asleep, her arm around Biscuit, her breathing slow and even. He ran through it quietly, He could accept $180,000. He could close Maeve's corner, stabilize their life, to find another kitchen, eventually. Lily would not lack for anything material. He sat with that thought for a long time, turning it over, until it settled into its final shape. Then he remembered the afternoon he came home from Vaulted after handing in his station keys. Maeve had been at the kitchen table with her hands around a mug of tea, looking at him with the absolute steadiness she brought to everything that mattered. And she had asked only, had he been right? He said yes. She said, then there is nothing to regret. He got up quietly, went back to the kitchen, and opened the drawer. He went to see Aldrich Webb the next morning before opening, the manila envelope under his arm. Webb led him into the back office, cleared a chair, and poured coffee from a stovetop pot without asking. Caleb laid the documents on the table and waited while Webb read. The old man went through each page with the care of someone who had not expected to see them again. When he finished, he set them down and looked at the wall for a moment. He said they had told him it was a consulting retainer. He had not read the full addendum at the time of signing. He was not a dishonest man, and he was not pretending otherwise. He was an old man who had been given complicated paperwork and a plausible explanation and had not pressed further. He said he would speak on the record, that the clause had been presented to him without full disclosure of its legal implications, and that his lease agreement with Caleb was valid and in good standing. He said this without hesitation, poured more coffee, and they sat together in the back office for a few minutes without talking about anything else. That same evening, Diana Ashworth reached out to Caleb by telephone. She had heard about the anonymous forum post through a contact in the food journalism community who recognized the shape of it. She was direct. 22 years in this field had given her a reliable sense of the difference between a restaurant with a genuine problem and a restaurant with a well-funded enemy. She asked whether he would speak further for a follow-up piece. He said yes. That night, Charlotte, Owen, Caleb, Webb, and Diana gathered around the large prep table in the closed kitchen, strip lights on, and chairs pulled in from the dining room, and built the plan together. Charlotte walked through the financial exposure. Owen laid out the timeline of events and his partial trace on the post. Webb described what he was prepared to sign. Diana listened to all of it and took careful notes. 3 parallel tracks emerged by midnight. Webb's attorney would file a formal affidavit invalidating the exclusivity clause with the Ashford Commercial Conduct Board. Diana would publish a follow-up piece, and Caleb would hold a community evening at the restaurant to re-establish his standing in the neighborhood. Shortly after 11 o'clock, while the others were still talking, Caleb received a message on his personal phone from an unknown number. It was a photograph of an internal email. Sender, Marcus. Recipient, Gisèle Fontaine. The message described the campaign against Maeve's Corner, in specific, operational terms: the health inspection, the pop-up arrangement, the forum post. The word Marcus had used as the operational directive. The summary of the assignment he had been given and completed was neutralize. The sender of the photograph did not identify themselves. Caleb showed it to Charlotte immediately. She made a secure copy before anything else. He put the phone back in his pocket, returned to the table, and said, "We have everything we need." The article Diana Ashworth published in the Meridian Fork did not name Fontaine Dining Group directly. It did not need to. She described a documented pattern of regulatory interference, anonymous online defamation, and an undisclosed exclusivity agreement deployed against a small neighborhood restaurant, following its repeated refusal of buyout, offers all on the same commercial block, all within a compressed timeline that followed a single published review. The piece was headlined, "Who is Really Afraid of Maeve's Corner?" It ran on a Thursday and was referenced by 4 regional outlets before the weekend ended. The Ashford Commercial Conduct Board opened a preliminary inquiry the following week. Based on the formal submission filed by Webb's attorney, his affidavit, the original documents from beneath the floorboards, and a declaration that the exclusivity clause had been executed under conditions of misrepresentation. The language of the filing described the matter as relating to potential unfair competition practices, specific enough that everyone in the local business community understood exactly what was being said. Gisèle called Caleb at 7 in the morning on the day the board filing became public. Her voice had changed. The controlled flatness that had characterized every previous exchange had been replaced by something more effortful, a calm being constructed, rather than naturally expressed, the way a structure looks different when it is being held up from the outside. She said she wanted to resolve the situation. She said she could offer substantially more than $180,000. She used the word settlement twice. She said he was in a position that would continue to cost him more than it could ever return, and that she was giving him a final opportunity to walk away with something real. Caleb was standing at the back of the kitchen, one hand on the edge of the reach-in cooler, watching through the small porthole window into the dining room where Owen was setting tables for the lunch service, folding napkins, aligning salt and pepper, doing it with the careful attention he perpetually pretended not to have. Caleb waited until she finished. Then he said, "I don't want a settlement. I want to open today, tomorrow, and next year. I don't need anything beyond that." He said it without heat and without volume, the way he plated a dish with attention and without excess. There was a pause on the line. He heard her exhale, slowly, in a way that sounded less like composure and more like something giving way beneath the surface of it. The call ended. Marcus resigned from Fontaine Dining Group that afternoon, citing personal reasons in a brief email that no one inside the company found convincing. 2 days later, Giselle's communications team issued a press statement clarifying that the company had no involvement in anonymous online campaigns and no knowledge of any irregularities in the Delwood Block's commercial leasing activity. The statement's careful passive constructions were precise enough to be legally defensible and unconvincing enough that no one who had read Diana's article believed them. The community evening at Maeve's Corner was held on a Friday 2 weeks after the article ran. Without a formal advertisement word spread through the neighborhood, through Charlotte's contacts, through the regular guests who had been coming since the first month. Every table was taken within the first hour. Lily stood at the door in a yellow sweater and handed people folded paper menus she had printed from the restaurant's single desktop computer, with a small drawing of a bowl of soup she had added in the corner, because she thought menus should have pictures. Webb arrived early and sat at the table nearest the kitchen window, ordered the pumpkin soup and the braised short rib, and ate both courses slowly, watching the room fill with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has waited for something to work out and is allowing himself to believe that it has. Near the end of the evening, when the dining room had thinned to the last few tables, a woman came in alone and waited at the door. She was in her mid-30s, dressed plainly, and she said her name was Jessica Brandt. She said she had spent 4 years in operations at Fontaine, before being let go for refusing to authorize a falsified supplier quality certification. She had read Diana's article. She said she thought the time had finally come. She did not ask for a table or for anything in particular. She stood in the doorway and said what she had come to say, and then she mentioned that she had been hearing about the soup for weeks. Caleb brought her a bowl himself. He set it down without ceremony, refilled her water glass, and stepped back. He understood that some people come to a room not because they need to be recognized, but because they need to be somewhere that feels honest. He left her to finish in peace. 3 months after the community evening, the Ashford Commercial Conduct Board's preliminary inquiry was still proceeding. Fontaine Dining Group had placed its Delwood acquisition plans in indefinite suspension. Plans for Fontaine 11 were absent from all public communications that season. Giselle Fontaine remained the company's chief executive and continued to appear at industry events, but with less of the open assurance of someone who had never once miscalculated in a room where people were watching. Maeve's Corner had been fully booked at both lunch and dinner for 6 consecutive weeks. Caleb had hired a second-line cook, a young man named Dex, who moved fast and said little and learned everything twice as quickly as most people. Caleb had trained, and the kitchen had found a rhythm that felt, for the first time, sustainable rather than improvised. Owen Garrett signed a partnership agreement over a bowl of soup on a rainy Tuesday morning, taking a 20% stake in exchange for sweat equity, ongoing kitchen work, and a weekly meal for himself and whoever he chose to bring. He had insisted on the last clause personally, and Charlotte had written it into the contract without comment. Charlotte came in on the first Thursday of the 4th month with the composition notebook and the folder of receipts she had been maintaining since day 1. She opened the notebook to the current month's summary, placed it on the table between them, and pointed to a single line at the bottom of the page. It was the first month in which revenue had exceeded expenses. She did not make a speech about it. She pointed at the number and nodded once. Caleb looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he folded the notebook closed, slipped it into the breast pocket of his chef's coat, and thanked her quietly. She went back to her coffee. On the last evening of that week, Caleb stayed after closing to put the prep work to bed. He turned off the main lights in the dining room and worked alone in the kitchen under the strip light above the range, portioning stock and annotating the following day's menu in his careful block letters. He could hear the street outside, cars passing, a window opening somewhere above, the ordinary sound of a city block in the late evening, a place that was inhabited and continuing. He had come to find it deeply steadying, in the way that only familiar sounds can be. Sounds that mean the world is at its usual pace, and you are still part of it. He went to look at Lily before he finished. She was on the small sofa in the corner of the prep room, exactly where she had slept on more nights than he could count, curled on her side with Biscuit tucked against her stomach, her breathing slow and even and perfect. The cardboard sign, the one she had made and insisted on the first morning, and that he had quietly replaced twice with fresh cardboard, tracing her letters exactly each time, so it always looked the same, was still in the front window, its edges beginning to curl with age and a little moisture. Today's special, made with love. He stood in the doorway between the prep room and the kitchen for a moment, looking at his daughter and the bear and the sign in the window and the pale streetlight falling through the glass, and then he went back to the range and finished his work. No one called Maeve's Corner the best restaurant in Ashford. No one needed to. It had not been built for that. It had been built to be the kind of place people came back to week after week, in ordinary circumstances, without a particular reason except that it felt like something worth returning to. That was a harder thing to manufacture than a reputation. It required a cook who understood that a dish was not a statement, but an act of attention toward the person who was about to receive it, and it required a room that understood the same thing. Giselle Fontaine, with all the capital and strategy and institutional precision of the empire she had assembled, had never learned to create that feeling. She had learned to impress, and she had long since mistaken the two for the same thing for long enough, and in enough rooms, that she had stopped noticing the difference. Caleb Harrington had known the difference since the evening. He watched his wife adjust a soup recipe in a basement kitchen with no windows, taste it once, nod slowly, and say quietly, "Now it will keep someone." He turned off the last light, locked the door, and carried his daughter to the car in the dark, Biscuit tucked under her arm, and the city going quietly about its business all around them. He would open again at 11 in the morning. The soup would be ready before 10. That was enough.